Hello everybody, this is Jack Butler, and this video is the condensing of all the research that I've done on the European Union and to try and help you make an informed decision about whether to stay or remain. And really what I'm aiming at is to get to what I would call the real reasons. I think you and I can probably agree there's been a lot of spurious stuff put into the space. And hey, I may just be one other person that's doing that for you, but what I'm really trying to do is get to the heart of what I think are the critical issues. And I do believe this is a really high stakes decision. It is the biggest decision of a generation. It may be the biggest decision that you are part of in your political lifetime. So I would just like you to have some ability to sleep at night that you made an informed decision that came from the right kind of reasons. So I'm going to tackle a lot of issues. I'm just going to get through it, and I welcome your comments and pushback. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is immigration. And I'm going to take an unpopular view. I think immigration into the UK is a problem. I don't think leaving the European Union is the solution. I do think immigration is a problem, and I'll tell you why. I think immigration is a problem because I think certain communities bear the brunt of large numbers of high immigration, and I don't think there's been the resources in place to cope with the integration that's needed for that. So whether you're looking at the UK or the European Union, I think there needs to be more support around that level of immigration. Let's be clear, one of the reasons why there's been such high immigration into the UK since 2004 is because the Blair government didn't take the opt-out, which a number of other countries did, for a 7-year delay on immigration from Eastern Europe. So there were high numbers of immigrants from particularly Poland, as you know, and that was partly from a UK sovereign decision. So let's be clear about that. When I walk down a street in London, if I'm looking at a shop and I can't really understand what the shop is because it's written in a language that I don't speak, there's part of me that feels like that's a problem. Versus most liberals, I am more comfortable with people saying, if you want to come and live in the UK, you have to put attention on learning English. There needs to be resources to support that. But I think there's a cultural integrity piece here that people do want to be able to walk down the street and hear English or Welsh or Gaelic or whatever their native language is. And this is coming from someone who's hugely multicultural. I speak different languages. I love speaking French. I speak other European languages. So I'm a Europhile when it comes to languages. But when it comes to cultural integrity, I think liberals have been soft on the immigration argument. But I don't think that coming out of the European Union will solve it, and here's why. Two things I want to say. The first is that I don't think it's in the UK's interest to leave the single market. And so if we were to come out of the European Union, I think we would still want to be part of the single market. That access, that free access to 500 million consumers, maybe there's some way that we can negotiate a free trade agreement, but I just can't see how the terms would be as good. Why would Europe want to give us all the benefits without the costs of membership? And we would go from being law makers, being sat at that table, to being law takers. And we'll come on to sovereignty, but there's a sovereignty issue there. The second thing is there are fairly predictable trends that you can see with immigration, which is basically once countries join the European Union, and it happened to a certain extent with Western Europe, and it happened to a greater extent with Eastern Europe, there's a large influx in the numbers of immigrants, and then it flattens off. So the influx that you've seen, it's not like there's a continued large influx from Poland. Right? It gets to a certain point and then there's equal numbers of people kind of going back and forth. So we need to just be sober that we can actually make some pretty robust predictions about how immigration would go. So this idea that it's uncontrolled, I get that the UK can't specifically stop someone that's coming from another European country, but the idea that it's uncontrolled gives a wrong impression. There's actually some fairly predictable ways that it happens. And we think something like Croatia joining, we have the moratorium in place more than other countries. So we're going to delay it longer that there's immigration from Croatia. And I think we need to exercise our rights to do that. And I think we need to lobby our government to put those sorts of conditions in place because it's within its rights. So I don't think immigration is the reason to leave because I think we should stay in the single market, but I do think that immigration is a policy, and I do think that liberals talk about it in a way that they don't really understand the felt experience and impact that some people have of their community being changed in a very short period of time. So let's have a robust conversation on immigration, but let's separate it out from our membership of the European Union. Secondly, security. I think we can deal with this one quite quickly. The UK is not part of Schengen, so when you come to UK border control, they're going to ask you for your passport or for your residency documents. If there's anyone that's on a watch list that the UK doesn't want to let into the country, it doesn't matter whether those people are European citizens, they have their right to refuse people border entry. So in terms of dangerous people, criminals, terrorists, we have some rights there and we need to acknowledge that. And I think the benefits from cooperation that we get from being part of, for example, the Schengen Information Sharing Service, which is a way of sharing car registration plates and thumbprints across the European Union, I think the benefits of that outweigh the risks. And we also know that we have, the biggest terrorist attack in the UK was a homegrown terrorist. So we need to do all we can, given the transnational nature of terrorism, to be part of the solution with other countries that want to fight it with us. Let's look at wage depression. Wage depression is a massive issue. Wage depression comes mostly from what? Not the European Union, it comes from globalization. We live in an increasingly globalized world, and this has had a strongly negative impact on low-income jobs. It's not just in the UK, it's across the board. So let's not confuse the European Union's impact in that. There is a very small impact of being a member of the European Union. Most of the economists that looked into this have agreed that there's a 1 pence per hour wage depression from the sort of competition for low-income jobs that being part of the single market encourages. But 1 pence per hour, that's 40 pence per week, that's £20 per year. That is not the biggest deal versus the wage depression that comes from globalization. So you need to be clear about which forces are at play here. And there are a whole set of problems that you and I live in a globalized world. The reality is, we're not going to change that. The reality is that we are living in that globalized world. So you and I need to be sober about what that means. And our frustration at some of the impacts of globalization, we need not to project them onto the European Union if the European Union is not the base reason. So we need to separate out European Union and globalization. People talk about TTIP, which is a particular deal that the European Union and America have been trying to put together. I don't think this is a valid reason to vote to leave, because I don't think in all likelihood it will actually happen. They've been at it for years, and they haven't been making demonstrative progress. So the one possible future, you've got to make this decision from the right level of analysis. If you don't like a specific policy, that is not a reason to leave. If you don't like a specific policy of the UK government, do you up sticks and go live in France? So we need to separate out specific policies that you may not like with the overall types of benefits and cooperation benefits that happen from being part of a club. So TTIP not likely to happen. We can talk about sovereignty. I think this is a big issue. I think it was smart of Gove and Boris to focus in on sovereignty, because I think sovereignty is one of the big issues here. I do want to point something out, that when most people think about sovereignty, they're using a specific concept of sovereignty that came into being in the late 18th century. It's called the Westphalian notion of sovereignty. You don't need to know much about this, but it's a treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia that was signed in the 1780s. And it basically says that a country's internal affairs are its own business. And there's something brilliant about living in that sort of world where a country's internal affairs are its business. That's just not the world that you and I live in anymore. So what was a brilliant idea 2 or 3 centuries ago is no longer the reality of how the world works, for better or for worse. And often it can be for worse. I'm not here to say that globalization is inherently a good thing. I think it has pros and it has cons. And some of those cons hit the most vulnerable and affected people in our community. So we need to be sober about it. But you also need to have a 21st century understanding of sovereignty. And that if we live in a globalized world, if we live in a world where a lot of our biggest issues, climate change, pollution, terrorism, these things are not country-specific issues. They are transnational. They sit above nations, above nation states. So it makes sense to try and cooperate on those issues. Now, you could say we could come out of the European Union and we could cooperate on those issues. And that's plausible. It's not plausible to say that we would have the same level of cooperation, because the European Union is all about pooling some of our interests to have greater levels of cooperation. So if you care about those issues, if you worry about climate change, if you care about combating terrorism, I don't think it's a reasonable argument to suggest to leave. What you might want is that there are more decisions being made in Westminster. And I would support you in that. There is a movement, a cross-Europe movement, to have national parliaments more involved in European decision-making. And I think that would be a good thing. And the red card, the sort of green card, the yellow card, the veto that could come with that, I think would be a good thing. So that's in the works. But that's about voting to stay in to reform Europe. It's not about voting to leave necessarily. Because even though we may get more decisions made in Parliament, if those decisions are just worse decisions because they don't have the harmonization across Europe, the idea of taking back control can therefore be a fallacy. It might feel good to have more decisions made in Westminster, but if actually those decisions don't allow the sorts of outcomes that we want in terms of binding people into things like climate change agreements or into certain protocols about how we make our products, then it's a false victory. It's what we call a Pyrrhic victory. And I think we're in real danger of that. So you need to understand that decisions being made in Westminster is about the right decisions being made in Westminster. It's not a net. It's not like we want 60% or 80% or 90%. It's about the right decisions. It's about governance at the appropriate level. And if we're talking about issues that can't be handled by one country, then we want to have the kind of cooperation. And often you need to give a little bit up to be in that. It's like, let me give you an example. I used to have a company. I founded a company in London, ran it through my 20s. And I had a business partner, and I had a senior management team, and I had employees. And sometimes there are things that you can't do as quickly or as easy as you would like when you have a team like that. Now I have a business where it's just me, and I can decide I want to do this, and I can make it happen. I can decide I want to shut the office tomorrow. There's no one to tell me not to. But if you compare what you can achieve as a solo business versus a company that has a partner and a senior management team, you're comparing chalk and cheese. So if you really want to have an impact on the decisions, the kind of policies that you care about, we need to be part of a bigger structure to do that. Otherwise we're like a big fish in a small pond rather than a big fish, because don't make no mistake, the UK is a big fish. When we talk, Europe tends to listen, particularly because we hold more of the pro-business, more of the Anglo-American worldview. And that is a distinct voice in Europe, and Europe knows that it needs us around that voice. So when we take the opportunity to lead, we tend to listen. There's a lot of policies that we've got our own way on. By the way, while we're at it, which country has more opt-outs than any other country in the European Union? Is it Ireland? Is it Denmark? No, it's the UK. How many opt-outs do we have? We have twice as many opt-outs as any other country. So the package that we have is a package that no other country has, which is why Europe sometimes looks at us and says, you have an exceptional relationship with Europe and you're still thinking about leaving. That's curious to a lot of Europe, because in a sense we can have our cake and eat it. We already have our cake and eat it. We already have a privileged relationship. The proportion of our GDP that we put into Europe is as low pretty much as any other country, and is certainly lower than the richest countries in Europe. So the deal that we have with Europe has been one that they've worked pretty hard to kind of keep us in, right? So I don't want to go strongly into the economic reasons, because I actually think the economy isn't the biggest thing here. I don't think we can predict it either way. I do think on balance that most people think in the short term at least it would be to our disadvantage to leave. But I don't think the economy is the big thing here. It's like we're in a relationship with Europe. And if you just think of an intimate relationship, you don't leave an intimate relationship generally for economic reasons, right? You may find that you have more or less of an ability with a partner to pay down a mortgage or support a family, and those things are important. But ultimately it comes to what is the quality of this relationship? And are we better together or are we better separated? When couples fail, that's kind of ultimately what it comes down to. And if you think that we're better off leaving Europe, you just need to be fully in touch with the realities of no longer being in a club that will still be creating laws on our doorstep that at certain points we will have to play ball with, and we will not be as in a powerful position to influence those decisions. So the net impact on sovereignty, in my estimation, would generally be down, even while we get more sovereignty over decisions, but they just might not be the decisions that can impact the things that we want to impact. I hope that makes some sense to you. The other issue that people often talk about is accountability, and I think that is another real reason. And I think for those of us that are principled and want to have our politicians enact on things that we, the people, the sovereign people, decide, I think this is an important issue in the European Union. I do want to put it in context, though. People don't seem to understand how young the European Union is. It's 25 years old. That is very young in terms of political institutions. If you could cast your mind back to the creation of the United Kingdom, or let's say the Act of Union with Scotland, if you think about how much democracy there was at that time, versus how much democracy we know and experience now. Two very different things. So to look at the European Union and say, well, it's undemocratic, what you want to look at is what's the trend? Is it becoming more or less democratic? The European Parliament is now something where we have popular elections, so that is more democratic. The European Parliament can remove the Commission, so it does have oversight of the Commission. And you need to think of the Commission in real terms, because people think of the Commission and they compare it with the UK government. And that is not necessarily a fair comparison, because they have differences. There's some fairness, but they have differences. The civil service runs the government in the UK, but it doesn't make the big decisions that set the agenda. And when it comes to Europe, the big agenda is set by who? It's set by the national governments. Part of the genius of Europe, which it doesn't talk about enough, is the fact that it's intergovernmental as much as it's ever federal or this idea of a superstate. It's intergovernmental. It's governments coming together to make those decisions. So the UK government has a big part to play, and has, in the the agenda, in the direction, in the way that Europe proceeds. And then the Commission figures out legislation it can propose to deliver on that agenda. So the idea that these unelected bureaucrats run Europe, that's a very misinformed way of talking about it. They are delivering on an agenda and a strategic plan that's set by your national government. That's the reason you can be both a British and a European citizen, is because of this intergovernmental nature and federal nature of Europe. It's actually a really genius invention, and it's unprecedented in human history. And it's young. It's 25 years old, so there's a whole number of things that it doesn't do well. But 25 years, if you can just draw the lens out, democracy, that kind of culture, that kind of way of doing things, it takes time. And Europe's initial aim was to create some kind of peace and prosperity in Europe. It didn't care at the time, frankly, so much about being democratic. That now is really part of the agenda of reform across Europe. This is not just a UK agenda. This is a pan-European agenda of people that would like to reform Europe. So the ultimate question really is, what are the benefits that we get from this cooperation, and what kind of benefits would we lose if we stepped outside of the European Union? If you just want to be rational and do a cost-benefit analysis, that is one way that you can kind of parse this decision. The other thing you want to think about is what kind of world do you want to live in? In the native Indian tradition, the First Nation peoples, they have this view of the seventh generation. You probably heard this, right? So how does this decision, how would any decision we affect today, how would it affect the seventh generation down the line? And that's what we need to be in touch with when we make this decision. This is a one-time decision. And I'll tell you why, because there is no chance that we would get back into the European Union with anything like the opt-outs that we have today. The opt-outs, we've had political leverage in the past to stay in and have these opt-outs that we have tailor-made for us, basically. Those opt-outs are not going to be part of a future renegotiation. They're going to be off the table. You've also got to think about the nature of negotiation if we vote to leave. When I left my company, when you're sitting around the table with the people that stay in your company and you being not part of it, there is a certain quality that happens to those negotiations. You are no longer fully welcome at the table. You're no longer part of the club. It is them and us. And that is how it will be if we leave the European Union. So you can think that, we're going to send Nigel Farage and he's going to negotiate some amazing free trade agreement. Let's just get into reality here. We are going to be making an agreement, 27 other countries on one side of the table, us on the other. It's going to be in their interests to strike the best deal for them because we're no longer part of their club. They're also going to want to strike a deal that has a deterrence factor in it. Because there are some other movements in other countries where people are like, well, maybe we want to leave the European Union, or maybe we want to renegotiate for a better deal. And it's going to be very, frankly, plain and clear in the European Union's interest to deter any other country from doing that. So they will want to make some kind of example of the UK. And I'm not saying we need to be scared of them in a negotiation. I'm just saying be sober about the emotions and about the context and about the dynamics of that kind of negotiation, which could go on for a number of years and not come to an outcome that you would like to tick and vote for today. So I'm not scaremongering. I don't have an interest in scaremongering. I'm in reality about how that kind of negotiation could go. And the chances that we would somehow negotiate a better deal, even though we already have 4 opt-outs, even though we already pay such a low level of our gross national income, even though Cameron negotiated some specific things, some UK-specific clauses in terms of us not being part of ever closer political union, the notion that having left, that we could come back and strike a better deal, I frankly find that very hard to believe. Unless you want to leave the single European market and you want to only be in this free trade agreement view of the world. But let's also be sober. Canada, 7 years and waiting on their free trade agreement. These are highly complex and involved negotiations. And if we're only interested in a free trade agreement, yes, it will be some kind of priority for Europe, but I think it will be less of a priority if we're also leaving the single market. And if we don't leave the single market, we're still going to be subject to the same immigration policies because there's no way really that we're going to get around that. So I'm just trying to put a soberness into people's decisions, that they really understand the options that are in front of them, and that they take this decision seriously, because the people it will affect are our children and the unborn generations. And if we are going to come out of Europe on the basis of an immigration argument, that, I think, is a disservice to the future generations of this country and for the people who fought so hard alongside our European partners to create the kind of peace and prosperity and multiculturalism that we enjoy today, which is a feat. If you look back at how humans have been with each other in Europe across history, it is a remarkable time that we live in today, and I don't want the efforts of the previous generations to be in vain. All right, I took 20 of your minutes. I was trying to do it in 15. Thanks for staying with me. I'd love your pushback and your questions, and when it comes to it, I'd just love you to take a moment and be in your heart and integrity when you make this decision on Thursday. Here's to creating a better world together. Thanks for listening.